Hello and welcome to the Chromatic Podcast, where I bring you a fresh coat of innovation, ideas, and insights from top experts in business, arts, and culture. I'm your host, Craig Bundren of Bundren Painting, and the creator of the Bundren Building Arts Foundation. Today's colorful guest is Amelia Earhart. That name might sound a little familiar to you, but this is a fantastic story about a girl who was given a name and felt a need or desire to live up to that name. It would take her on a journey that went all the way, the entire circumference of the globe. She's an artist, an author. She was on television as a broadcast journalist. Just an amazing, completely authentic person that you're going to want to spend some time with. I know you're going to enjoy this as much as I did making it. So let's cut right in and get rolling. All right, Amelia, thank you so much for being on the Chromatic Podcast. I'm so excited about this. I've had a lot of guests on, and everybody has been almost one thing. And it's, this person is an artist. This person is a business person. This person is a color selector. You are multifaceted. You've got a world of experience by you. And I want to start off with the one thing that I hope you're not tired of, that I know everybody hits you up for, but your actual name is Amelia Rose Earhart.
Yes, it is, Craig. And thank you for allowing me to join you today. I've been looking forward to this for a long time because, you're the first person who's reached out to me as artist Amelia Rose Earhart, which is such a new part of my life. So thank you for seeing that part of me and for asking about my name too. It is a big part of my life. It's part of almost every day, especially pre-corona, when we go out into the real world and have human interactions, people's faces when they hear Amelia Earhart, is always a little strange. I get called up to the front of, any commercial flight I'm on because the pilots want to say hi, or, people even on calls where, I had to make a call about about purchasing a home recently. And they said, Amelia Earhart, what's going on here? So yes, my name is Amelia Earhart, and my family shared the same last name, spelled the same way as the first Amelia Earhart, who of course was an incredible, daredevil adventurer, aviatrix of the 1930s, who attempted to fly around the world and disappeared in 1937. And she left behind such a legacy that, in 1983, when I came along, my mom and dad decided, let's go for it. And they named me after her, different middle name. Amelia's was Mary and mine is Rose, after my great-grandmother. But basically they wanted to inspire me. My mom had this very aspirational, and still does, idea that, her little girl can grow up and be whatever she wants. And she talked my dad into it. My dad said, oh gosh, she's going to feel like she has to explain this name. She's going to feel like she has to spend her whole life talking about Amelia Earhart. What if she feels like she needs to learn how to fly someday? Right? And how funny is that my dad had that foresight, because his other question was, what if our daughter feels like she has to fly around the world someday? And I did feel that. And I did fly around the world. We'll get to more of that later. But the irony of all of it, Craig, is the fact that I'm not related. And for a long time, I thought I was. So I consider that to be a big turbulent part of my life when I learned that, because I had already learned to fly and I had really gone in full force towards piloting. I had spent my early 20s and 30s training for my private license, my instrument rating, eventually my commercial license, which I hold even though I'm not a commercial pilot. But basically I raised all this money to fly a plane around the world because I wanted to live up to this big, heavy name. And right before I launched, I found out I wasn't related, which I got a lot of criticism for. So
I think there's a lot of people in the world that look for things to criticize, but
oh my gosh. Yeah. And it was in the early days of Twitter. This was 2014. So people did not hold back.
I think it's really, really, really cool that cool is not really the word I wanted, but that's the one that came out. So I think it's really cool that they gave you that name. But with that, I mean, there's so much that you can do and can't do. It's like, I've got this namesake, but you took it and I was discussed with people. It's not a lack of resources. It's a lack of resourcefulness. So not only did you embrace this name, but you went and used this opportunity to bring people together to. I'm a pilot. I'm a private pilot.
That's awesome. I love that you know that, because that's going to make it so much easier for us to chat aviation, and I can say things and not have to go, okay, this is what this means.
Right.
but yes, go on.
as a private pilot, I had access to Cessnas, and I flew tailwheel. I flew a little Citabria, then I had decathlon. But a dream for a private pilot is to get like a Bonanza that holds 6 people, or a Baron. You got a Pilatus. And for everybody out there, a Pilatus is one of the most beautiful airplanes. It's got a range. You can fit so much in it. It's a comfortable airplane. So the fact that you not only learned to fly, but brought this into fruition, that you are going to fly a Pilatus around the world is amazing. And that, flying to from Houston, where I'm located, to Oshkosh one time was a big deal for us for the air show. You flew around the world. I mean, go into that a little bit and what that was like.
Gosh, even though it's my story, I'm not trying to be, oh, look at me, or whatever this may sound like. But when I hear you say that, I think I get chills, because I think, how on earth did I pull that off? You know how restrictive aviation is. Absolutely. You know how hard it is to get permission to do anything that is out of the normal bounds. And somehow, because I was, I'm a driven person by nature. I have a ton of energy, and I look around me, right? You can tell everything in my life is big and colorful, and as much as I can make it. And I think because I was given this name, Amelia Earhart, and early on my parents thought we were related. So every adult around me would say, oh, you better fly someday. You better learn to fly. And as a kid, you really, you soak up all those messages, and you feel like if you don't do that thing, whether it's sharing the same last name or first and last name with your father, that feeling of a name being passed along, and that there's so much weight that goes along with it. I thought, I better do this. So it just so happened that when I took my first flight lesson in Boulder, back in 2012, I think it was, maybe earlier than that even, I looked around and I was like, I cannot not do this. This is so much fun, right? It's such a joy. And it did start in those small Cessnas. And it was such a struggle even to get that part of it done. My parents had no extra money. No one helped me pay for it. I had to save up, and I would work 5 jobs at a time, part-time this and all that, all while going to school at CU Boulder. And it was such a coordinated effort that just took on this momentum of its own. It seemed like as soon as I said out loud in the world, hey, my name's Amelia Earhart. I learned to fly, right? People were already like, okay, that's interesting / weird / scary. Everybody has their jokes about it. But then after that, I started thinking, oh my gosh, what if I could fly around the world, in a modern day aircraft? I wanted to show young women that aviation was an attainable career goal, that it's an interesting, career path, or even just a path as a hobby, to where you don't have to be this, rough and tumble tomboy all the time to be a pilot. You can be more than one thing, right? You can be feminine, you can fly a plane. It's just a matter of putting your mind to it. So when it got it in my head that maybe someday I could fly around the world, I thought, do I want to do it in a twin, right? In a twin engine plane. Amelia flew in a Lockheed Electra 10E, which is a twin end, steam gauge, aluminum aircraft that was just, gosh, how would you describe it? I mean, you would use the stars and a point on the horizon with celestial navigation to determine where you were. I mean, there was no GPS on this thing. So I wanted to do it if I was going to fly around the world in a modern plane. So I reached out to a couple different aircraft companies, and Pilatus, being based here in Colorado, that's their US base, even though the planes are manufactured in Stahn, Switzerland. I pitched them. I wrote a crazy business plan, and I said, my name's Amelia Earhart, and I had already paid my way through PC12 training. You go to a flight simulator school where you learn how to fly this plane. And I walked in and I said, I'm a PC12 pilot, and I'd like to fly your plane around the world. And they said, you can't do that. You don't have the range to fly. And we coordinated the construction of an auxiliary fuel tank, which put 200 extra gallons on the plane, and we pumped it into the wings. And it's wild to think, but 28,000 miles and 14 countries over the course of 18 days, 16 stops. And I flew about 10 hours a day with my co-pilot, Shane Jordan, who, borrowing a $4.5 million plane is not something an insurance company just says yes to. So I get a lot of crap for having a co-pilot on my journey. And whenever somebody questions me about it, I say, so when was your last flight around the world?
Right. It's easy to judge.
It is. And I thought, I'm so glad that you as a member of the aviation community are embracing my story, because so many pilots didn't. I got so many criticisms about why I was doing it, or the reason behind it, or how, or, the fact that I'm not a professional pilot today. People really wonder why not. And it's like, I just have so many different things I want to do and try in this life. Aviation plays into everything I do, but that journey itself it's wild.
That's an amazing journey. And I don't want to geek out too much on that. And I do want to ask, so you said you flew about 10 hours. Was that your longest leg?
That was, my longest leg was 9 hours, 45 minutes between Singapore and Darwin, Australia. And we had a 45 knot headwind. We were flying like near Malaysia, right? This is a very mysterious part of the world for me. And some of my alternate airports, if we had encountered tailwinds that slowed us down and required us to burn more fuel, we would have landed in like Jakarta. This was not a good place to be with those kind of headwinds, but it all worked out. I actually brought a prop for, anyone who's going to watch this, the video portion of the podcast, but I have this little globe here that I use for my speeches. So these are the legs of the journey. Should I list them off real quick? It only takes a second.
Sure. Absolutely.
So we started in Oakland. From Oakland, went to Denver, to Miami, to Trinidad and Tobago, to Natal, Brazil. From there, across the Atlantic Ocean, and flew to Dakar, Senegal. That was the first time crossing any ocean where you have no option to land, and that if anything goes wrong, you're going to ditch the plane in the water. That was intense. From Dakar, we flew to Sao Tome, Tanzania, Seychelles, Maldives, Singapore, Darwin, Australia, Papua New Guinea, 2 island hops through Kiribati, which are these tiny little, just the narrowest point of the island is no wider than the minivan, right? That we got taken to the hotel in. This was like so remote island atolls. Amelia Earhart was out there somewhere, still missing. Mm-hmm. And from there, I flew to Hawaii, and then Hawaii and Honolulu, all the way back to Oakland. And that's the longest stretch anywhere on the planet that any pilot can cross without having an alternate airport to land at.
Wow.
Yeah. And we were the first PC-12 to ever make that flight too, because no one had ever drilled a hole through the side of this plane, and no one had ever put an auxiliary fuel tank on a PC-12. So you as a pilot, how crazy that is, that Pilatus...
Weight and balance and everything in there.
Oh my gosh. And it's a Swiss aircraft company. I was going back and forth between here and Stans. I got to ferry a plane back across the North Atlantic. Like sometimes I say these stories, or I'll be giving a keynote address. I'm like, whose life is this? It's so fun to have this, checked off the list, because I think now I just turned 38 recently. And I thought if I hadn't done this yet, I would probably be thinking about it all the time. What could I have done? What could it have been? And I'm so glad that I just pushed for it and asked for this crazy, audacious, thing to happen to get permission to do it, because there are so many more reasons why it shouldn't have worked than reasons that it did. And I think because we really attacked it really intelligently.
You've got aviation, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of laws. And then you start adding all these other countries of airspace and going over these places, and who are you and what are you really trying to do? And
exactly.
It is such an amazing feat. I hope people realize what an amazing feat that is. I'm sorry. I'm just really excited about it.
No, I appreciate it. And I love that you get it, because these types of flights, there's a website called earthrounders.org or .com. I'm not sure. It's a site that somebody keeps up, and it's all the data about flights around the world. And I think there's something like single engine. Only a couple hundred flights around the world. So one engine, and if anything goes wrong, you are ditching the airplane into the water, and ditching is landing on the water. So I went to open water survival training courses. My co-pilot came with me. He had to go through, I've got my survival suit here in the house, because I'm starting to break down my survival gear as I start to work, or as I start to work towards publishing my book. And I'm going to do some pieces about what all was in it, what it would take to stay alive, floating on the ocean if you were able to survive and wait for a rescue to come. So I learned how to use flares, and I learned how to signal with a mirror if everything goes wrong. And, this is hilarious, but because I'm actually going through this stuff right now, this is a lifesaver from my survival kit. Okay.
Oh, really?
Because Survival Systems USA is this company in Groton, Connecticut that does this gear. They pack it all in for you. And so everything is in this big orange kit, and they put lifesavers in there, which is so ironic. But the reason they do is just because it's sugar, and you want to be able to have quick sugar in your system. But for this lifesaver, I have to think it was a little joke that they would hope that someone would get out there floating around on that raft. So
you don't want to be the person that's getting the joke.
Exactly. No.
One last question about that. I did catch a snippet of one of your keynote speaks, and we'll go into the fact that you are a keynote speaker as well. But I believe that you said something. I hope you said this, because I hope I'm not making it up. But once you get over water, you could hear any little sound that airplane made that didn't sound normal.
You could hear sounds that didn't even exist, if that makes sense. Because just like, the second our senses are heightened and we're fearful that something could go wrong, we almost in our minds look for those things in a way. And so I would turn to Shane, and I would look to my right, and he was so respectful. He wouldn't roll his eyes and go, "Oh, don't worry about it." He hadn't done anything like this either. He was a high-time pilot. In fact, the requirement from our insurance company was that he needed something like 8,000 hours of flight experience to go as my co-pilot, basically, so that we had this combined effort to make this flight together, just in case anything went wrong. And he would listen. He would say, "Let's investigate it together," right? And I felt like he respected me. He allowed me to be the true pilot in command of that journey. He wasn't, taking me along on this flight. And so we would listen, and we would think about it, and we would adjust. And, it was constant communication around the entire world, adjusting with altitudes and airspeeds and slight subtle heading changes. Because when you're crossing an ocean, you're thinking about fuel, even if you're flying between Centennial and Boulder here in Colorado. Fuel is on your mind the entire time, right? When you're crossing an ocean for 10 hours, you are locked on that fuel gauge, right? So we had to monitor our headwinds and our tailwinds. If we were getting too strong of a headwind, we would have to request with air traffic controllers, in the most remote parts of the world where accents are so thick. And even though English is the international language of aviation, dialects and just tones and even pacing of speaking on an aircraft high frequency radio, not even a normal VHF radio that we have here in the States. This is a high frequency radio. It sounds like a garbled TV channel back before, when you'd be like between a radio station. That's what we would be listening to get heading changes and these very specific instructions over the ocean.
That would be stressful. I think I would be on pins and needles.
I still dream about those sounds too, because I think when your mind works to obtain information that critical, right? When you're waiting, you remember the moments around waiting to hear news about a family member that you're concerned about, or a health concern. You really get stuck with these different memories. And so sometimes I'll hear those high frequency radio sounds, because I have to think that it changed me, making that far of a journey around such a short period of time. And it's just, it's a neat experience. I feel so fortunate that everyone trusted me enough to try to do something so crazy, because imagine if Amelia Earhart would have crashed a plane on a flight around the world. Okay.
Yes.
Get back to the global scale and away from just me. Think about the news cycle, right? So
yes.
Pilatus, Honeywell, Remova Luggage, GoPro. I had these massive sponsors. Pratt & Whitney, my engine company, was one of my sponsors. And there was a backup plan that if anything went wrong, they would deliver a PT6 engine to the remote location wherever we were if we had crashed or had an engine failure, which never would have happened. But the contingency plans and the backups that were in place to pull something like this off were so complex that now it's like, we're in a pandemic and I'm like, yay, I responded to an email on time, and I'm proud of myself. And I'm thinking, that's the real benefit of flying around the world, is that now when I'm starting to slack off or be lazy, I'm like, really? I think you can do it.
That's there's so much to that, and I could go so much more in there, but you have done something wonderful for yourself and for those that know about general aviation, the aviation community, because that's a place that's been in trouble somewhat for years with airports closing, and people just don't pay attention to it. It's not romanticized as much as it was back in the day. Right. But that you really brought it forth front, right, and center. So
thank you.
Really neat.
I tried. It was difficult because, even documenting something like that while you're going was hard. I didn't have a camera crew with me. Shane, he wasn't the type of person that would want to pick up a phone and take pictures. So when I look back at the amount of pictures and video that I collected, it's so minimal, right? But what I wanted to do was, during the flight itself, I wanted kids all over the world who were tracking us on this really cool website that we had built. They would watch this little red dot go all around the plane or all around the world. And you could learn about weight and balance, and you could learn about weather and geography and like these cool things that we had planned so that kids could get more familiar with aviation. And also we had started this, one of the really neat parts about planning the second half of the trip over the South Pacific was that right over Howland Island, which is where Amelia disappeared, near Howland Island, she was trying to reach that location after departing from Papua New Guinea. As Shane and I circled over, we handed out close to $100,000 in scholarships to girls 16 to 18 all over the U.S. Each one of them got, and aviation scholarships is like, here's $1,000. Well, you use that, and then you want to fly so badly, but it's nowhere close to getting you to your goal. So we gave each girl $7,500, which at the time was the national average, to pay for a flight, to get you all the way through your private pilot's license. And I think all of them have at this point, but we've been able to hand out a couple more scholarships, and I'm about to transfer the remaining scholarship dollars over to a really exciting aviation project that's tied in with Amelia Earhart's birthplace in Atchison, Kansas. So there is a longer term ripple and aspect to the flight that was about general aviation. And I wish it could be a bigger part, but it is one of those industries that I think is going to go through such a change in the next 10 to 15 years with the pilot shortage. But basically I was just hoping to show people that adventure is still possible. Not every adventure has to be a daredevil attempt by yourself. Coordinating something really elegant and sophisticated and doing it as a team with an incredible co-pilot by your side, whatever form that may come in, go for it, because life's short and sometimes a pandemic occurs and no one's flying around the world now. So right. I think the big goal was for aviation, yes, but I think for everybody just to go, maybe I can do this one thing that feels like a flight around the world. So with that, you started a foundation, correct? Mm-hmm. You started that foundation. So that foundation was to give those scholarships to bring people the ability to get a pilot's license. Is that still an active foundation still? It's active in the sense that we are getting ready to transfer, it's over $50,000 to a group that's working to create a beautiful facility in Atchison for flight training. And Atchison, Kansas is where it is from. But basically, during the trip itself, we had asked girls all over the U.S. to write essays about, why they wanted to learn to fly. And I wanted to keep it real simple. Each girl would be flight training in her own hometown. She and her family or her, whoever was mentoring her locally would help her pick the right flight school. And I would kind of, chat with the girls about how their training was going, but there wasn't a lot of pressure to, get to a certain point. These girls didn't have to go into aviation as a profession afterwards, but basically it was a great way to open it up to just girls who had that dream, just like me, right? Like, okay, no one's handing me the keys to an airplane here, but you still have that goal of getting up there. But it seems so daunting from I want to fly to I have, $300 or $400 per lesson to learn how to fly. I mean, I'm sure you relate to that, right? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I wanted to take the financial barrier away. But I think for me, running a foundation at the time, it was a great way to fundraise, but it's not something that I think I can handle full time, because I'm not, I don't fly often anymore because of the price, because of other goals, buying a house, being an adult, things that have taken all my flying funds away. So when I transfer that over, I'll still stay involved with the Amelia Earhart festival that happens every year. I get to go out and participate with a panel of speakers and talk to folks all week about how awesome Amelia is. And in that town especially, she is alive and well.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So you at a young age, you go and talk someone into letting you use their airplane. You fly it around the world. You do all of this. You've accomplished so much. It made me laugh because you said, talk about doing adult things like buying a house. I'm like, you just secured a $1 million airplane, flew it around the world. But anyway, so you were a broadcast journalist prior to this, or did this come afterwards?
No. That's a crazy thing, Craig. This whole time I was planning the flight around the world, which took more than 2 years. I was getting up at 2:30 in the morning and going to work. Wow. Because, so when I first started taking flight lessons in Boulder, and it was one lesson, and then I would save up for a couple of weeks. I would take another lesson, and I'd forget everything I learned in the first lesson, and I'd save some more. So it was a very slow process. But one day I was out at the airport, and somebody, I can't remember how exactly the connection came to be, but the Boulder, or the campus press, the newspaper, showed up, and we took some pictures and did a little interview. And it was like, local girl Amelia Earhart is learning how to fly. Okay, so it was just a cute little human interest story. Well, that story got picked up by Fox News and all these national outlets and all these groups. And then locally, 850 KOA, which is the 50,000 watt AM talk station here in Denver, the news director heard or read that story and said, "Hey, Amelia, will you come down and let's do an interview?" Well, she asked me all these normal questions about my life. Are you related to Amelia? I said, yes, my family thinks we're somehow distantly related. It was a very general story that we had been told about how we were connected to her. So I told that story. And so, how one thing rolls into the next? It was Amelia Earhart, distant relative, is, learning to fly and will someday fly around the world. So it was just this ball of momentum around it. So that went out on the radio. My flight lessons picked up because I felt all of this pressure. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, at the end of that 850 KOA interview with Kathy Walker, she's the one who started my entire career. She's still the news director at KOA today. She offered me a job at the end of the interview. And I was like, I have zero experience. I literally put on my resume to be an on-air traffic reporter, which is where I started out in studio, just doing radio updates. But I listed that I had worked at Sonic as a car hop. I had worked at golf courses, mowing the grass and, picking up trash. And so here I am with all these high school jobs. And then I lead into this career where I'm working on KOA, KHOW, which is another talk station. I would do KDCO, which was a station that I had listened to in Boulder, the classic rock station. And suddenly I propelled into this adult space where I was working, driving. I would get up in the morning. There's a point to this one. You'll appreciate it because I think this kind of makes sense where the early hours started. So when I was working in golf courses or at golf courses to save up for my flight lessons, I always volunteered for the morning shift. So I would come in at 4 a.m. You have to get out there before the golfers show up. Well, then I get this job at the radio station where traffic is heaviest in the morning and the evening. So I would drive from Boulder all the way to the Denver Tech Center. That's an hour in my Toyota Tercel, stick shift through rush hour traffic every day. So I would drive there in the morning for an hour, report on the traffic, drive home to Boulder, go to class all day, and then I would get back in my car and I would drive to the Tech Center to do the afternoon drive home. So I'd cram all my classes into like 3 or 4 hours in the middle of the day. And then I would go and report on whatever classic rock station or whatever station needed traffic, 3 to 7 p.m. And then I would drive all the way back to Boulder. So I had a 4-hour commute. I was still getting up, I think at 2 a.m. at some time. So I've been doing it so long that now I just feel like it's how everybody does it.
I was going to say, but I bet at that point that being all new, that was just the most, the coolest thing ever to be doing.
It was, I don't even think I had a cell phone for some of that time because that's what year it was. And I would get questions everywhere I went, like, oh my gosh, you're Amelia Earhart from, KOA. And they would put me on a sticker. I was like on a billboard, because it was pretty smart to put somebody with a crazy name, on radio, because most radio personalities, their names are made up or there's a kind of a goofy story behind it. This was really my name. And because I was flying, one thing led to the next, and they put me in the news helicopter. So I had a $3 million office
Wow.
that I could cruise around in. When I was like a junior in college, I started doing that job. And it was out at Jeffco Airport, which is now Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. And my pilot, Jimmy Negri, who is this incredible pilot who had been flying for the Denver Police Department for years in their chopper, he would sit front right seat and I would sit front left seat. And there weren't dual controls in this helicopter. So I had a big laptop controller where I ran the camera on the outside of the helicopter. And I also reported from inside. So I had a little camera over my shoulder and I turn around and like put the sunrise behind my head and, good morning, check this out. We're over a car chase. We're over a fire. We're over a, big car accident. And I did that for a long time. 3 years here. And then I got to spend a year working in Los Angeles in their news helicopter. And that was crazy working out there because I get called in the middle of the night for anything that would pop up.
Car chase.
And then 5 or 6 helicopters would all pick up from the same airport, right? We'd all lift off and we would just zoom towards the scene of whatever was going on. And it was very competitive. So it really mattered as to which helicopter got there first. I haven't thought about this part of my job in a long time. I flew over Michael Jackson's funeral in a helicopter.
Oh, wow.
There were 29 helicopters right over the mausoleum where his service was being held. And I was reporting live on CBS, national news, and updating folks about, all the freeway closures. And it was so wild because, working in the aviation industry, that's such a rare thing to have any sort of access to the real world, right? It's usually sealed off. You're in the cockpit, everything's private, or you're doing it alone. But in that case, we had 3 or 4 cameras up there at all times, and the stations could hear us while we were talking, and it wasn't always smooth.
That would be a dream job. I think that would be a dream job.
I'm like, why did I leave that one? That sounds fun.
So after you've done this for a while, then you come up with the keynote speaking. So you're hired by companies to give keynote speeches. And I assume you have several speeches you give, but go into that a little bit.
This is like my favorite thing to do. Okay. And before the Corona pandemic, I would go out to, whatever event was being held. And basically as a keynote speaker, you get to fly on the day before, get a nice night's rest. You show up in the morning, you deliver your speech, really to match the goal of whatever conference you're attending. So whether it was an event that I did in Santa Fe for Capital One, which blew my mind that the credit card company that I used to pay for my flight lessons with was paying me to speak and give them advice. I was like what's happening? But I use the idea of learning to love the turbulence as like the basis for this speech, which can be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half. I can get up there and tell this story, basically the longer version or maybe shorter version of how I've been sharing it with you today. And I've turned it into this, what I think, and what a lot of companies, have shown me through hiring me for their events is it's a really dramatic way to, remind people that life's turbulence, not dramatic way, I should say, but it's a way of storytelling and showing a real life experience of navigating and course correcting around life's turbulence. Because just like when we take off in any airplane, we can check the weather all we want. But if we're planning on traveling to somewhere that's, any distance away, there's always the chance of weather popping up along our route. And in that very literal context, we have to change our flight plan as we fly, right? There's no one on the ground is going, boop, 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 right? Change the autopilot. Let's direct this plane to Chicago. We make the decisions. And as pilot in command, I think you hold yourself accountable in a different way than we do here on the ground. And it's not a value judgment. It's just that in an airplane, if you don't think with accuracy and immediacy, you're going to crash the plane. you literally have to act within seconds, moments of any change happening or storm standing in your way that's going to change your airspeed, your fuel burn, any of those changes that need to take place. So when I equate it to how we can take those lessons and use them here on the ground, if you operate as pilot in command of your own journey in how you respond, in how you carry yourself, in how you make decisions, accuracy, immediacy, relying on your flight crew, understanding what it means to fly past a point of no return. That's one of my favorite speeches to give because I relate it to, like you mentioned earlier, the sounds that the airplane makes once I passed 80 miles offshore from Natal, Brazil, as I was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, because the point of no return is the point at which the airplane can no longer be controlled to glide back to the point from which it departed. I'm glad I remember that definition because it's an actual, mathematical equation that we do when we cross oceans. So your point of no return was 80 nautical miles offshore. And I believe the entire length of that particular leg was something like 2,450 miles, right? Nautical miles, and 80 miles offshore. Anything past that, if anything goes wrong, you're going down in the water. Mm-hmm. So if we use that here on the ground, right? If you're committed to something and you in your mind know that at this certain point, I'm going all in, like I'm going to keep writing the book and see if I can get it published. I'm not going to dawdle around and let's go all in. Let's see if we can get across that ocean. For me, that's where the really exciting stuff happens. And, with some keynote speakers, you kind of get the role of like, oh, you're just a motivational speaker. You're like, rah, rah, rah. I'm like, no, I crossed oceans. I'm allowed to talk about this stuff.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So you've brought up the book. You are currently writing a book?
It's done.
Oh, it's done.
It's done. The book is not physically done, but the writing portion is done.
That's good.
That's the hard part.
Yes.
I didn't know how to write a book. I tried for 7 years. And with all these stories, how could I not? Right.
Right.
So
absolutely.
I needed to take my own advice in that sense. I never committed to it. I never made it take flight. So I worked and worked and worked. And then when the pandemic began, I was like still working in television. And I had gotten reached out to by a company that basically connects you with ghostwriters. And they said, oh, we've got this incredible woman, Kristen Clark Taylor, who we believe that you guys could, put together a really great book. And this might be a cool opportunity. Well, I ended up working with her and we wrote a beautiful book that is 16 chapters, which are 16 flight lessons. And each one corresponds with a story from my flight with a life lesson and a metaphor built into it, but they're not cheesy. They're not, it's not 5 steps to success in whatever field. This is like, charting your own course and respecting the holding pattern and navigating and course correcting, right? And it's about how we actually do things in airplanes. And if those tactics were able to keep me in flight all the way around the world, even with the crazy turbulence that I experienced, learning that I wasn't related to Amelia, we can talk about that if you want. That's a crazy part of the story because basically using the lessons to show that not only did I take a physical object around an entire planet when lots of people were saying, you don't deserve to do this flight, you suck. I was one of the early ones getting canceled there for a bit, okay? Because, the whole world was saying they had an opinion on whether or not I should do this flight. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just went through this major life shift when just months before I was supposed to launch on this flight. So over $1 million raised, if you think about the fuel cost and like the man hours and the fuel tank, and even things like putting the logos of 28 different corporations on the outside of an airplane that needs to fly through crazy changes in air temperature. I mean, the things that needed to be checked off this list were wild. So part of it was like a big media plan as well, right? We wanted to talk about the upcoming flight, share that story with the world. And I got an invitation from the Today Show. I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to go to, my dream TV show to work on as a broadcast professional, but I also get to talk about airplanes and share this story about the foundation and what we're about to do coming up. Well, back in college, I had hired a genealogist to help me figure out how exactly I was related to Amelia, because I was so sick of people just saying, okay, how are you connected to her? Oh, you don't quite know. And I would go, well, my family says that somehow back in Pennsylvania, our families lived in adjacent counties. We didn't quite know. So I hired a woman in Boulder who took a couple weeks to help me figure this out. And she came back to me and was like, okay, Amelia, here's how you're related to the other Amelia. Your family lived here in Pennsylvania. This is common ancestry traced back through the 1700s. And she had all these different ways why we were related. And then, because I'd paid about $500 at the time, which I had saved up for on top of flight lessons.
I was going to say a flight lesson.
Oh my gosh. More. Yeah. I mean, and here I am trying to I'm like, Mom and Dad, can you guys help me? Like, sorry, we don't, we can't really help out right now, on top of college tuition and working at the, crazy hours at the radio station. So she says to me, but in order to really figure out the actual pinpoint connection, we need to go into the European records. And that's going to be like another $3,500. And I was like, first report is fine. Thank you very much. I'm related to Amelia. And it's not exactly like a pinpoint thing, but that's okay. Right. So I go back to my family. I'm like, look, this is cool. You weren't wrong. Again, it's not set in stone. Fast forward to the Today Show in 2014. And I go on and I answer all the questions about, hey, this is what I'm about to do. This is, the plan. And they wrap it up by saying, gosh, and your name is so amazing. How are you related to Amelia Earhart? And so on national television, I'm all, I'm like, I share a distant common ancestry with Amelia, traced back to the 1700s. And I give the whole spiel that I had been giving my whole life, right? From the genealogist point on. Mm-hmm. And I just felt great. And I floated off to the airport, get on my commercial flight to go back home. And when I landed, I was being called every name in the book. On Twitter, I was being told, Amelia, how dare you? I hope you crash into the ocean and die. I'm like, what is going on? Like, what did I do? Right? Something happened between the time I left New York and the time I landed in Denver. Well, one of my colleagues at 9 News, who was an amateur genealogist, had researched my family history on his own time. And at the end of the newscast, when they were showing the clip of the Today Show, like, oh, our Amelia was on the Today Show today. She's about to fly around the world. That anchor basically said on TV, well, I've looked into it. Amelia is not actually related. So imagine when Denver's sweetheart, right, the traffic girl who's getting ready to fly around the world and has all this on the line for being this, I started a foundation, right? I'm doing all these good things. And then suddenly I look like a liar because of how that was presented to the world. And so I'm immediately being called into work. I had to sit down and give a statement on TV to say, I'm hiring another genealogist. I don't, there was like this weird presumption of guilt, right? And here I am like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I've got 28 sponsors. Okay. And not like Joe Schmo down the street chipped in $20. I was getting $50,000 checks from Honeywell Aerospace that I would use to configure the SATCOM installation on the plane or work on the fuel tank. I mean, this was a high level situation. And so I had to figure this out. And so my TV station immediately says, Amelia, you embarrassed us. Like, you look like a liar. We've supported you. We've cheered you on for all these good reasons. I'm like, I don't know what to do. So because I was, almost 30 at the time, had the money in the bank to do this, I called up, I think it was ancestry.com or genealogy.com. I think we worked with both of them. And I said, look, I need to hire someone right now. Here's the situation. Please give me a human. This is not like the 1995 sign up for, the do-it-yourself thing. This was a human who would help me figure this out. And it cost a lot of money. And for several weeks, the Today Show, the following day, so I was on the show. And then after I figured all this out, it was at 9 News and I was doing the traffic, and I would be on the green screen and I would come off and I would just bawl my eyes out because people were mocking me and saying terrible things. And then the Today Show ran a poll this is like an out-of-body experience. The Today Show ran a poll and said, well, it turns out that girl we interviewed, Amelia Earhart, that's about to fly around the world, turns out she might not actually be related. Do you believe her? Like, what a weird thing to see about yourself, right?
Yes.
And people voted, and luckily, Natalie Morales, who was the anchor who happened to be there both days, she said, yeah, she goes, she thought she was related. Who cares? That to me was one of the coolest responses because she had spent time with me, right? She knew my character.
Mm-hmm.
Well, people continued to mock, and I had to wait for, weeks to get this genealogical report back. Well, it turns out that this genealogist came back and said, you share no common ancestry with Amelia. You are not related. The first genealogist probably found enough connections to make it look that way. But your family's actually French and, like all these different connections that had no tie to Amelia. So I'm like, oh my gosh, like, okay, now I'm just this random person who just loves airplanes, right? And I've got all these qualifications and I've got this hugely sophisticated plan that if it doesn't happen, I have drilled a hole through the side of a $4.5 million airplane. But here's the thing, Craig, and I'll bring it back to the keynote as well, because I think this is what I'm about to share. I'm speaking to a group in Louisiana later tonight for a virtual keynote. But this is what it all comes down to. In that moment, I had to decide how to navigate around this turbulence that had popped up for me, right? I'm already a pilot for years at this point, 10 years. And I knew the consequences if I ran away from it would be terrible. If I just said, oh, I'm sorry, oops, or said, oh, I should, I don't know what my response would have been, but if I would have ran away from it and just avoided the consequences, I would have been on the hold for a lot of money. I would have completely embarrassed myself. I would have ruined my reputation. And I looked myself in the mirror and I was like, I've got to figure this out. So I called each and every one of my sponsors, and this wasn't just a contact at each group. I mean, these were CEOs and high-level executives who had signed off on this plan to trust me to represent their country on this, or their company on this massive ordeal. And each one of them, all 28 of them, said, Amelia, this is totally out of character. Like, we get you. We know how much you are invested in this. You wouldn't have done this if this was just some ploy to be using the Earhart name or have this like connection to somebody. I'm like, I'm just trying to live up to this namesake I've been given. So with that in mind, we kept the fight going, and we basically, came out with a new statement. I said, look, I'm not related to Amelia, and I'm still a pilot. I've still worked to this level to get all these crazy ratings and put myself through schooling and done all this work to, to build it and the foundation and all this. And a lot of people still had controversial opinions about it, but that didn't matter, because with the right permission, I was able to complete that flight. And the big life lesson that came out of it, which I'm so proud of, knowing at this point in my life, is that it wasn't important that I was related to Amelia. It was only important that I learned how to relate to her, relate to the type of person that would take on something so adventurous in the 1930s, like flying around the world when she didn't even have GPS, or, think about how cold it would have been at those altitudes, flying in an old plane like that. She took on this challenge in such a crazy way. I thought, it's 2014 and I've got all these incredible, intelligent people behind me saying, we believe in you. So it's time to show the world that it doesn't matter who you're related to, where you came from, what your name is. If you have done the work, then you deserve to go out and do whatever the heck you want. And I flew around the world.
Such a building moment for you. I mean, there's so much there. If that hadn't happened, it would have been a different story. Not it wouldn't have been less impressive, but you wouldn't have grown from it the way that you have. Well,
thank you. And I agree. I mean, I look back at my younger self and I'm like, you go, girl. Like, what? Because honestly, it took a lot to even ask for those things to be possible, right? Like, who says, can I borrow your plane to do this kind of trip? And so I thought, if I ask that, I certainly can ask these people to trust me and to know that my intentions are good. There was no deceit, no, I wasn't trying to derail anybody. And once it was over, the life lessons and they just continued, right? It was 18 days flying through these incredible places that I had never even, in some cases, seen many pictures of other than the airport. Flying in and being met by groups of people who wanted to celebrate us along this journey, and people who, because we matched a lot of the stops to the original Amelia Earhart path. So in Dakar, Senegal, we arrived to this big celebration, kids and flowers and like big white gowns and these beautiful women who met us out of the airplane. And, that's where I started to realize that everything that was being said on Twitter about whether or not I deserved to go, or whether or not this was a stupid story because I was in a modern airplane and it was too easy, or, oh, she has a co-pilot, so who cares? That all started to dim, right? I turned the volume on that down, if I think in my radio context, and I turned the volume up on what I was actually seeing, which was, this. And if you're on Twitter, you think you're seeing this, but you're really looking in a mirror, in my opinion, because the things that people were saying were so hurtful and so unkind that I know that the only reason I would ever say something like that to another person is if I were feeling so terrible about myself, right? So I think it's a Paulo Coelho quote, who wrote The Alchemist. He said that the world is changed by your example, not by your opinion. So it was my little way of trying to change the world a little bit. And now that I'm back, it seems like anything's possible. And I'm really starting to feel that a lot more with my art, and going through the pandemic. We'll see what happens next, but it's I just feel fortunate to have had that adventure, and I hope other people can kind of sneak their way out there and do things that are a little bit off course.
So you've gone through so much, done all these things from flying planes to being a television personality, and now with the pandemic, I've seen that you've started doing art, and with such a commonality with driven people that are driven to succeed. They also have a creativity inside that's dying to get out and have to find a way to express themselves. And you seem to have found that in art. So go into that a little bit. How is that? And I think it almost, the stuff that I've seen you do ties into what you saw when you were flying a bit.
Yeah, it does. And, the pandemic has definitely allowed me to show off more of what I'm doing, but this is, I would say, my art career, we'll call it, because I am taking it to a professional level now, which is exciting and scary. But it started in early 2019. And, after you fly around the world, you go back to your normal job, which is still like a really cool job, going back to work in a TV station here in Denver. I wasn't in the helicopter, but I was at the anchor desk, right? Like, still a very cool thing. I was like, well, kind of feel like flying around the world was exciting, but now what do I do, right? And I'd been in a relationship with a guy for, 3 years at the time. And I painted something, and I was so proud of myself. And I was like, look what I made. And he was like, oh, like, and I said, oh, I thought I would hang it on the wall. I thought it was kind of cool. It was an abstract blue and white kind of wave sky thing. And I thought it was nice. And he was like, no. And he really rejected it. And after we broke up, a couple of years later, I was like, man, I want to paint again. I want to figure out why now I'm afraid of art, because, getting that criticism, I just felt like there was something blocking me. And I went to the store and I got some canvas and some paint, and I went for it because I was on Pinterest one day, which I love. And I had seen all these posts of people that were doing fluid art, right? Pouring all these acrylics into one cup, and then you dump it out on the canvas and it explodes in every direction. And it's like, wow, it's almost hard to look away from it. And I was like, I feel like I could do that, right? Because there's not a lot of technique to it, which I've since learned there can be quite a bit of technique to fluid art. But I saw these, I was like, I'll give it a shot. And I did. And it was like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I was like, wow, I made that. Like, I took the power back from thinking, okay, your art is ugly and we need to hide it in the closet. And I was like, this is beautiful. And then I posted it on Instagram. I very much think of myself as an artist of like the Instagram era, because, artists before social media would have to wait years, lifetimes, probably never, to show their art with the world. I can now do it in 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. And I can show it to, hundreds of thousands of people all at once. And so I posted something and I got all this feedback. It's like, oh my gosh, Amelia, that's beautiful. How did you do that? So much joy and excitement about it. And I felt it too. So I just kept creating. And what I did was I took the aerial photos from my flight around the world. So flying over the Maldives, places where you could, it's such a pain to get there from the US that most folks will only see these places in images. And here I have pictures from my iPhone that I had snapped from the cockpit of this plane during my flight around the world. And when you look out over the shorelines, especially when you're getting close to landing in island locations, you start to see these really subtle changes in the sand as beaches, will shallow up towards the shoreline, and the way that shades of trees and shadows will hit each other, and the rock formations and all these beautiful abstract concepts from above. I realized that when I was pouring paint, that if I used earth tones and I used colors that were, metallic, and then thinning them out with different mediums to create more of a gradient effect, with water getting deeper to shallow, I could do all these things and kind of create what looked like an aerial view from an airplane. So I started calling them aerial abstracts. And now I get to make them almost every day. And I'm selling my art online, and I've got prints. And I started looking in the mirror every day, like, how on earth do I get to paint? And people want to buy it. And it brings them so much joy, or it seems to. And the responses I'm getting are just lighting me up in a way that is as joyful as I felt in the early days of flying airplanes. So that's why I'm following it so much, is because it truly does feel like flying.
It's a great story, and the fact that you had one art critic and it shut you down for a couple of years, but you've always had critics as you go through, but you've always triumphed, you've prevailed, and put it out there, which is part of that, knowing your North Star and just going for it. What do you think is next for you in the art world? Is this just keep going this direction, or have you have another vision to follow in that?
I have so many ideas, Craig. I have big aspirations. In anything I pursue, I let myself go as far and wide as I can possibly take it. And I was listening to your recent episode with Sue when you guys were talking about how she knew she was a designer when she had her Barbie dream house, and she would spend all of her time rearranging the furniture.
Yes.
Okay, that is me. I bought this beautiful home in Sloan's Lake for myself going into the pandemic. That was interesting, and still is. But, I've got this big, huge space that to me looks like a big art gallery. And it's filled with these crazy creations that if I get an idea, I do it. And one of them is, you may have seen it on my Instagram if you haven't, the butterflies. So I did a huge butterfly installation in my home. So when you walk in the front door, I live in one of these townhomes where it's like all stairs. So the first thing you see is just a flood of colorful butterflies all around you. And because they're little wires, I took the tiniest drill bit, and you can barely even see it on the wall, and then it slides right in, and then each one is angled and bent out a little, and I put them all over the ceiling and all that. And then I posted a picture of it. And what did I get? Everyone saying, how did you do this? Where can I buy these? So I think that there is a model where I can take my creations and my wild imagination and creativity and willingness to kind of do the prototype on my own. I think there may be a future in creating these things for other people to take on for themselves, and helping people become artists in the same way that I did, which was just from a silly Pinterest video of going like, oh, this caught my eye, leaning into that, because just like I knew nothing about aviation when I got into it, it was like, whoa, there's a lot of rules here. You guys are really serious. Like, it seems like I don't really fit in here. In the art world, I think that's changing a lot, right? It seems very exclusive. Like, how do you just call yourself an artist? Well, turns out that's what you do. And we have so many tools at our fingertips, and art is a self-assigned, or artist is a self-assigned title, right? You don't have to go to school to be an artist. You can say one day that you take on the identity of an artist and you're a little bit different. Maybe you dress a little more colorfully. I brought out all my colors for you, by the way, because I love the title of your podcast being chromatic. Like, what a beautiful word.
Yes.
And I try to work so many colors into my life because of the colors that I've seen on my flight around the world. And going through all those different countries, meeting all those different personalities and people, and the people that were so generous along the way and wanted to hear the story, and the fact that people still want to hear the story today. That's why I feel, I don't know, like I've seen so much, so I want to make it colorful, I want to make it weird, but I also want to make it accessible for people. So maybe something in the subscription box world, but turning my ideas into more formal, I guess, concepts, kind of like my aerial abstracts. I didn't just say, I want to be a fluid artist. I want to create aerial abstracts because as a pilot, I have that perspective, and that's the unique perspective that I have. Nobody else in the world can say that you flew around the world in a PC-12, right? So how can I make my art represent that in a way that nobody else can replicate, but they can be inspired by it? Anybody can do fluid art, right? But nobody can do an aerial abstract.
My brain is, I'm one of those idea people, and my brain is just like going crazy inside because everything that you've talked about since the beginning of our conversation has a flow to it. One thing led to another that led to another. They're all related. Even when you get to the art, you brought the aerial, but everything has been on display for the world. So I wonder, does your art at some point, is this going to be exhibition art? Is it going to be public art installations? Is the world going to share in what you do? And I see that as a great possibility. And so, like I said, my brain's going crazy. This is great.
Thank you. Well, I really hope it does because, somehow I tend to, having a weird name puts you in weird situations because inevitably if you meet somebody, they go, oh, you have to meet this person. Her name's Amelia Earhart, right? And then you don't forget a name like that. So I find myself getting opportunities that maybe other people don't. And I'm also a very curious and excited person about everything. But I was downstairs in the lobby of this high rise where I used to live. It's called Sky House in Denver. It's this beautiful, crazy apartment. And I wanted to live there after moving out of my kind of home in Lakewood where I couldn't see much. And I moved to the top floor. And that's where I created all of this art. Okay. I created an entire series. I made one painting, huge painting for each leg of my flight. So from Oakland to Denver, that painting looks like what you look down and see. Mm-hmm. The painting from Natal, Brazil to Dakar, Senegal represents that ocean that I crossed. So it's a lot of blues and it's got rich silvers and all these metallics in it flying over those waves and just seeing those repetitive patterns, outside of the window. So there's 16 of those. Those are currently in an attic in a home that's a few blocks away from the home where Amelia Earhart was born, which is kind of cool. So those big, huge paintings are just waiting there in Kansas for me right now. So I need to go pick them up. But I could see something around that was showing off the paintings from the flight. But I also got to paint a mural because when I was in that apartment and I was taking all my paintings down the elevator, all stacked up on one of those big luggage carts by myself, I'm like backpack on, my wiener dog next to me. I got these 16 paintings and I'm going through the lobby and the woman who was the manager of the building goes, Amelia, what are you doing? I was like, okay, I just painted all of these in my studio apartment, by the way. It's all glass, but it was just a studio. So paintings drying everywhere. Took them all down. She goes, oh my gosh, we have a mural space downstairs. Would you want to paint it? And I was like, yes.
Yes, I would.
So I took this space, which was basically a window box on 18th and Broadway, which is close to the Brown Palace and this really cool historic old part of downtown Denver. And they let me take over this 25 by 15 foot space. Inside, you were like working in the glass. So imagine if you were, in New York City and you'd walk by all the window displays. I was working in there, but it was up off the ground. And Nubbin, my little wiener dog, would sleep inside of it with me in his little bed. And he would look at people while they walked by. And this is a busy part of downtown Denver. And people would like freak out when they realized I wasn't a mannequin working in there. And I'd wave. But the concept of the mural itself, which is still there, and they're going to have a hell of a time taking it down because it's made of glitter, okay? And it's a giant storm cloud. And I wanted to represent what I call glittering optimism, which is like a step above a silver lining. Anything can have a silver lining. Like when you look at it in hindsight, that's usually when people see the silver lining. They're like, well, I found the lesson here. I try to see, I always say that light is my favorite medium because it's so important in terms of how we take in art and glitter, even though it's the most hated it's the most hated thing of the craft world and the art world, especially. As it catches light and it changes and it's dynamically moving, I wanted to put that in a cloud. And so I did this 25 by 15 foot storm cloud of silver spray paint, glitter of every color of the rainbow, and then 3-dimensional clouds, which I made out of cotton and fabric. And then I lit them all from behind. And so when you walk by, you see this crazy storm of glitter, and people just stop and they go, what is happening right now? It's kind of overwhelming when you see it for the first time, but I hope you check it out.
I will definitely check that. I would love to see that. So wrapping it up now, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best place to go? Is it Instagram? Is it Twitter? Is it a website?
Yeah, so my website that has all the details about the flight, if you want to see pictures, if you want to see the route, that's flywithamelia.org. And the only thing on that website that's not up to date right now is the foundation information, but that's got all the good stuff with videos and keynote videos and stuff like that. To get in touch with me directly, Instagram is my favorite form of social media because it's the one that's most photo based and just, it seems like the happiest place to be for social. So that's a good one. And otherwise, I'm working on getting, working on this book. I'm hoping for a literary agent, and I was initially planning on self-publishing and just taking it that route, but I think it's got more than that. So I'm going to go big, and I've been sending those query letters out and saying I've got this great manuscript and a story about the flight around the world. So hopefully podcasts like this help get the word out as well, because I think it's going to be just a great story to tell.
This has been a great interview. Thank you. I think my face hurts because I've been smiling the whole time, but thank you so much for coming on.
Craig, thank you so much. And best of luck. I'll be sharing this, and I think you're doing a really good thing here.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Chromatic Podcast. You can learn more about what we're up to by visiting Bundren.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please rate and review it. Drop us a line. We'd love to hear your feedback. Join us next week for more insights on business, arts, and culture. Thank you for listening.